So allow me to briefly bring you to another continent of the world for the next 30 minutes. Most of us are familiar with the political phenomena of populism, especially as it has become a buzzword recently in global politics. Studies in populism suggest several factors contributing to the rise of a populist regime. It could be failed liberal democracies, socio-economic disenfranchisement, polarization in social media, and so much more. Fortunately, or unfortunately, populism has a very thin ideology, and so we can approach its study from different characteristics. Social scientist Cass Muddy observed that it is harder, even, to distinguish clear trends in areas like in our side of the world in Southeast Asia, although he mentions that there are shared characteristics among populist movements throughout the world. For this presentation, I will explain how our former Philippine President, Rodrigo Duterte Jr., fits the populist mold. Then, using the typology of agents proposed by James Keenan in a 2023 Theological Studies article, I will explore how the Philippine Church, in its broad sense as the people of God, not just the hierarchy or the clergy, can be located across several groups of agents. Lastly, I will present how populism presents a challenge and invitation to the Catholic Church's self-understanding and mission, not just in the Philippines, but perhaps globally. According to Filipino economists Ronald Mendoza and Leonardo Haminola, the Philippine populist preference emerged because of the inability of previous politicians to narrow the inequality gap in the Philippines, despite the positive growth that it has enjoyed in its post-dictatorial period. The inequality is glaring. Developed areas in big cities are surrounded by swaths of urban poor settlers. This is a typical aerial view of highly urbanized cities in the Philippines. Not to mention that there is a divide where much of economic development is concentrated in the capital, in the northern island group, which is Luzon, while the central and southern island groups, Visayas and Mindanao, are lagging behind. As you know, the Philippines is made up of 7,600 islands. So you can imagine, just in that green part, 80% or 77% of the country's GDP and development is just concentrated in that area. They also noted, Mendoza and Haminola, that growing concerns over the challenges and risks associated with rapid urbanization in all these cities includes the threat of crime, illegal drugs, rising transport costs, traffic, as well as economic uncertainty, have somehow contributed to the populist preference. Thus, if you put together the problem of incompetent political elites and illegal drugs, this paved the way for Duterte, whose campaign could be summarized as, I just did not put the three other statements because, well, sorry for the language. I hate drugs, I hate oligarchs, kill them all. Or as he would often say, especially when working or responding to human rights advocates, I don't care about human rights, I care about human lives. One characteristic of populist leaders is their rhetoric that pits two groups within a nation against each other. Sociologists Adele Webb and Nicole Curato wrote that, quote, Duterte framed his attack by building on the antagonism between, on one hand, weak liberal institutions, the oligarchs that benefit from the system, and liberal signifiers such as human rights, rule of law, justice. And on the other hand, interests of the nation and the popular sovereignty of the people. End of quote. This cemented the mistrust that people already had with systems, processes, the rule of law, human rights, and incumbent politicians that they expected to work for their welfare. Thus, those who criticized Duterte for his refusal to observe the rule of law, uphold human rights, or even submit himself to the investigations of the International Criminal Commission, especially for his anti-drug campaign, would be labeled as enemies of the people. And so, why am I presenting this in a theological conference? Where can we find the church? Considering that the country is made up of around 85% Christians, that's roughly 97 million people, 76% of which are Catholics, and that Rodrigo Duterte enjoyed an average satisfaction rating of 90% throughout his 6-year term, record high in post-World War II history, it is undeniable that Christians supported Duterte's regime. Following Jim Keenan's cue of making a list of populist agents just to better understand the phenomena, I will try to locate where we can find members of the Philippine Church among these categories of populist agents. My first one would be the easiest, the church among the populist masses. Definitely, we can locate the church among the supporters of Duterte. Sociologists of religion, J.E.L. Cornelio, together with Aaron Medina, have pointed out that some Catholics and Christians, including members of the clergy, vocally support Duterte and his bloody drug war. Some of the supporters that Cornelio and Medina interviewed said that Duterte's presidency was a godsend, since they believe that a strong and decisive campaign is necessary since, given their circumstances, a direct relationship exists between substance abuse and criminality in their localities. They consider drug users and peddlers to be people who deliberately engage in sinful actions. Thus, according to the supporters, and I quote, "God gave us this government to protect the innocent and punish the guilty. They have guns for a reason." End of quote. For many people, according to another study, the killings are acceptable because these are the people, and I'm quoting this, "These are the people that made our miserable lives even more miserable." End of quote. Cornelio and Medina observed that people feel safer now, which is why they remained supportive of the war on drugs. Even with the media reporting thousands of people, even minors who are merely suspected users, being killed extrajudicially, people generally never wavered in giving Duterte the record high trust and satisfaction ratings. The church among the elites. Notice the contrast here, similar to the aerial view of the cities that I gave earlier. I could not find a Catholic church. This is a local sect called Iglesia ni Cristo in the Philippines. When the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines synthesized the diocesan synodal reports in preparation for the first meeting of the Synod on Synodality held in October 2023, they published the National Synodal Report. Portions of the report contained the various sentiments of the clergy, religious, lay people that were shared during the nationwide, local, diocesan, and parochial synodal conversations across all 127 dioceses in the Philippines. The report's authors wrote, "Many of the underprivileged and those who were marginalized in society felt that they were also left out in the church. As the church is seen to be for the rich, the economically poor, as well as those who are deprived of social acceptance, are being left out. When the poor speak out or try to voice an opinion, they are simply ignored or set aside as unimportant. Many people feel that only the donors and benefactors, dubbed as the owners of the church, have a voice or are entitled to speak out." End of quote. As if affirming what respondents during the synodal conversations have already shared, Filipino theologian Vincentian priest Rolando Tuazon observed how the local church lacked a united front in being in solidarity with the poor who are faced with problems such as, and I quote, "agrarian reform, demolition of informal settlements, contractualization of labor, minimum wage, union organization, and strikes." End of quote. James Keenan assigns religious, cultural, and social leaders as agents who use the populist leader and the populist masses for their own gain. However, I disagree with this finding. This does not seem to be true for the case in the Philippines. Based on Keenan's list, the clergy and lay leaders of the Philippine Church, could be seen as more among the elites, who, knowingly or unknowingly, may have contributed to the disenfranchisement of the masses and have triggered the populist preference. The Church within the populist opposition. While we have already seen how the Catholic Church in the Philippines has been associated with the elites, this is not the case for the whole Filipino Catholic community. I don't want to present a monolithic singular understanding of the Catholic Church here. The Church's voice of opposition, however, did not start as a united front. However, it grew as members of the Church continually reflected on the challenge presented by Duterte's regime and the realization that the drug war had only targeted poor communities and not even the rich drug lords or their political backers. Filipino Jesuit theologian Jose Mario Francisco believed that Duterte's populism has challenged the Church and her evangelizing mission. In inviting the Church to examine how it fulfills its social mission of integral evangelization and integral human development, Francisco pointed out the need to challenge what he perceives to be a Manichaean perspective implicit in Duterte's view of drug users and the drug problem in the Philippines. This was an invitation for the Church at large to grow in recognition of those who have long been disenfranchised, the populist supporters, as well as those who have been marginalized by Duterte's brand of populism. And so, heeding this call to grow in recognition, using Paddy McQueen's exposition on the unfolding of recognition, Jim Keenan, in his recent book, The Moral Life, proposes that, and I have the quote there, the move from recognizing someone as familiar to giving recognition to one to whom it is due is the threshold into the moral life. This unfolding of recognition allows one to identify and acknowledge another person as a fellow human being, triggering, hopefully, our ethical responsiveness. Overcoming populism requires that the various agents, as I've already mentioned, grow in mutual recognition. Keenan suggests that the elites need to engage and recognize the populist masses, their concerns, their anxieties, their woes, their insecurities. However, I would like to add that the populist masses themselves are also called to acknowledge and recognize the humanity of the groups that Duterte has touted as enemies of the people, the elites, the drug users. For aren't they all fellow Filipinos? Fellow humans. Going back to Cornelio and Medina's study, they noticed that the church community's responses were related to the views of the drug problem and drug users. Some church communities would help drug users and sellers by praying for their conversion, simply because they think that that is the only way the church should respond, thoughts and prayers. Meanwhile, others provide a comprehensive repertoire of interventions, ranging from spiritual recollections, values formation program, livelihood support, counseling, and legal assistance. Cornelio and Medina observed that the communities that provided these more comprehensive interventions or responses were immersed in areas that were known to be hotspots of the drug war and the extrajudicial killings. By being immersed in such areas, the leaders and the members of their church congregation are, as Keenan writes, and I quote, vulnerably disposed to each other, end of quote, leading to their recognition of the drug war victims and eventually to their discerned moral response and conscience. Yet the victims of the drug war and church leaders live also in the same community where supporters of Duterte and his drug war could also be found. What would growing in recognition look like for the populist masses? In accounting for the unwavering support that Duterte enjoyed, Nicole Curator reminds us that this comes from the majority of Filipinos who were excluded from the country's economic gains over the past decades. Thus, critics of Duterte should disabuse themselves of the notion that his supporters are morally compromised, die-hard fanatics who, and I quote, call for killing sprees, scream bias at journalists, threaten rape and murder, end of quote. Amidst all these explanations, Curato offers another way of appreciating Duterte's supporters as people who are engaged in a constant negotiation between their politics of anxiety and their politics of hope. Thus, their understanding of good politics is defined more in terms of decisiveness rather than integrity, transparency, and accountability, which they would associate as values of the elite. Understanding these nuances does not come easily unless there is recognition of the hopes and frustrations brought about by encounters with them that makes elites, including church leaders, vulnerable. Perhaps this is how we could understand what Gaudium et Spes reminds us when it begins, that the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the men of this age, especially those who are poor, in any way afflicted, these are the joys and hopes, the griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. In presenting my last point, I am not suggesting that the Church abandon its prophetic role in upholding social justice and human rights. Considering everything I presented, I sense that the Church is invited to deepen its commitment to its mission. If the Philippine Church still believes it is called to be a church of the poor and for the poor, as it articulated in the 1992 Second Plenary Council of the Philippines, it needs to heed the call of greater vulnerability and recognition. Bishop Pablo Virgilio David, Bishop of the Diocese of Caloocan and President of the Catholic Bishops' Conference of the Philippines, can be seen as an exemplar in this mode. He has made Caloocan a place of mission stations, bringing church from the traditional parishes into the neighborhoods of the poor, where most of the killings are happening. Mission stations, which started sprouting in Bishop David's diocese, became the fruit of the clergy and lay leaders' recognition of people marginalized by both society and the local church. Rented houses in the middle of urban poor communities would become convents, communities of priests, religious brothers, and religious sisters. They also served as a base of operations for drug rehabilitation programs conducted in partnership with the local government and other civil society organizations. Such a setup provided the local church with a close look at how relationships can be transformed by growing in vulnerability and recognition. In the communities hosting the mission stations, one can see the various agents of populism I have mentioned earlier. In these neighborhoods, the encounters have transformed any anger, frustration, and resentment these agents may have with one another into fruitful coexistence that goes beyond mere tolerance. To sum it up, in this presentation, I have explained how the Philippine government's inability to take decisive action in solving the country's problem of illegal drugs and the long history of massive disenfranchisement paved the way for Duterte's regime. We have explored the variety of agencies related to populism that is present within the Church in the Philippines. And despite how populism thrives with the fealty between supporters and the leader and the antagonistic relationship the masses have with the elites, this cannot be the case for the Catholic Church. Populism has to be treated as a challenge to the Church's mission of recognizing and identifying itself with the poor and marginalized in society and even within its own ranks. Otherwise, the history of disenfranchisement, whether in the Philippines or anywhere else, will continue long after a populist's regime. Thank you.
Thank you. Simon? Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much. I love your paper. I want to play with the motif of recognition. I have argued that we no longer know how to recognize, because to recognize is to embody the praxis of epokes, or special judgment. We only know how to meet people. That said, would you agree with me to say that recognition ought to be the orthodoxy, the grounds of orthodoxy for the church. Because currently dogmas, or the way we understand dogmas, the way an orthodoxy, it's really a system of erasures, creating boundaries. While we might be against Duterte for what he did, killing all these people, we are also killing psychologically. Married and divorced, remarried couples, we ostracize them. LGBT plus people in the church, we ostracize them. We quote church according to church teaching, blah, blah, blah. And so, I don't think we are innocent in calling out Duterte. It's just that Duterte is a little bit barbaric, but we do the psychological harm as well. So, in what way would, if you buy my argument, that recognition is a type of orthodoxy, or is the foundation of all authentic orthodoxy, how do you think the church can reimagine itself?
I think I'd rather, instead of using orthodoxy, I'd rather use orthopraxis, as what some liberation theologians have used. And at this point in my research, because this is just a small chapter in a longer study that I'm working on for my STL thesis, I still find myself in agreement with what Jim Keenan wrote in his book, that recognition is really just at the threshold of the moral life. It's not the singular criteria yet. I mean, if you've read other materials on recognition, whether it's Charles Taylor, Paddy McQueen, or even Axel Honneth, there's a whole politics behind that, and even within the church. But if you just go back to our biblical tradition, it's basically the story of the parable of the Good Samaritan, who's able to recognize his neighbor in need, who's on the side of the road. And to ask ourselves, and I think this was raised earlier when we were talking about pre-conscious or unconscious forces that enforce our moral, that shape and inform our moral behavior, that kind of put blinders on us. So in a sense, if I were to bring that into an ecclesiological, or if I were to relate that into an ecclesiological question, I think it should go back to, that's one way we can understand how the church understands itself to be ecclesia semper reformanda. And even if the church does not read, it has to read, but also it has to listen. It has to listen. Ecclesia audience, ecclesia docens. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, we have time for one or two more.
Yes, Oscar.
Unless there's someone else. It seems, I think what brings the common theme that is coming up again and again is the structural issues underneath all these problems, which are ecclesial, societal, political. Poverty is a big issue. Do you think that we can ever sort out these issues with these discourses that we are having?
You know, if we could sort that out, we should not be having this conversation. We should just go out and try to already, strive for world peace. It's good that you mentioned the whole idea of structures as well, especially in relation to human agency, because I think that's also a big question still in ethics right now. Professor Alexander perhaps can chime in on that later without putting him on the spot here. But I mean, we have to also understand that even my understanding of this is that the whole way in which Duterte also even emerges in the Philippine context is also, I mean, his emergence is also within a particular structure of government. Not just structure, but even a culture that incentivizes certain ways of being and acting, even if they are morally unjust. Because the thing with Duterte is, even if he touts himself as a populist, and often populist literature will say the populist leader will always tout himself as a political outsider, Duterte is no political outsider. He's an outsider to national politics. But the way he ran things, it's within a particular way of rubbing elbows with people in government, whether that's by force or by fear, or the triple G's that we often call in Philippine politics, guns, goons, and gold, right? For you to win. So what you have that structure, and to ask ourselves, are we also critical of structures and culture and how they will incentivize certain behaviors? Because that will always constrain our moral agency, whether as individuals or as a church community that seeks to live out the gospel values. But then there will always be the tension.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of building off of even what you had just said there, I think, one of the challenges is, these leaders are presented as like these populist leaders, but like you mentioned, they are politicians. They are the elite. And I know often in America it feels like these so-called populist leaders are kind of manipulating the people rather than being the voice of the people. But yet, a liberationist perspective would say we need to foster this solidarity among the oppressed. And I know in America that's a huge challenge. How do you get people to see that Donald Trump is insane, and create this sense of solidarity really amongst the people who are being oppressed, who are often sometimes the ones cheering on the ones who oppress them. Yeah. So what's the church's role in kind of that fostering solidarity?
What's the church? Thank you for that wonderful question. Sounds like a Miss Universe question. Well, I think the church's role still primarily in that case would have to reflect on its prophetic function and tap into a prophetic imagination that is both, to paraphrase Walter Brueggemann, if I remember him correctly, to use a language that, cuts through or the numbness of the humanity that has been dormant in us or that we have failed to recognize, but at the same time proclaim a hopeful alternative reality. I'm always wary of having to say or having to encourage faith-based groups that part of their resistance would mean then how do we also, like in this particular case, and even here in the US, within the populist leader himself is also part of the church. And there is also that call for conversion, which may look differently for him as opposed to the masses or to the supporters, right? But then always, I guess, to provide those spaces for encounter. That's my generic Miss Universe statement for that. I guess I'm coming from an experience where in the Philippines, Jesuit schools, and I think that's also somewhat the case here in the US, where Jesuit schools are always associated with the elites. And so sometimes even part of our formation is just to provide spaces where such an encounter can happen, and then hopefully we provide seeds for gradual recognition, so much so that people can have, whether it's at the back of their heads or it's something that informs later on vocational or career choices, to always have in mind the poor and the marginalized, and not end up being the ones who make others poor or marginalized. I think I'm out of
30 seconds, please.
30 seconds. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I think what keeps resonating in our conversation is the handicap of we, the church, in responding to situations sometimes we create as well. We've used different categories to represent this, either the structural embeddedness of both our own inadequacies and as our own actions. And so it makes me ask the question, like when I was talking and somebody said the church is doing something. Of course, we didn't say the church is not doing something. For instance, if the first thing we want the church to respond to is to put up a communique, or what the church will do immediately is to put up a communique to let people know that he's doing something in that regard. But in the space of societal change, we have also come to acknowledge the fact that policy is also a structured way of doing something or doing nothing. And so we're talking about over-policing or policying. In other words, I don't want to do policy, I don't want to do anything, then I put a document. So that if you ask me, I say I've done something. So in that case, nothing is done. So I am asking in that regard, when we are looking for what would the church do, is it not an alternative way of saying destroy the structure of the church? Let church become internally revolutionary, in the sense that we are still impoverishing the people who come to church every day. Despite their economic situations, we are still tasking them to do things that the church may not actually need. Thank you.
Thank you.
Last word.
What comes to mind really is we also have to we understand that, I mean, like, given all our degrees here in this room and like all the studies that we've engaged in, there's always the risk of getting caught up with analysis. But I think part of how we can understand in terms of moving forward with an ethic of social action, especially for church as individuals or community, we really have to just find and work with based on the provisional knowledge that we have, and then evaluate. Which kind of like goes back to me like how we often tout that the pastoral cycle should be better understood as a pastoral spiral where one deepens and then evaluates and then sees and judges and acts again. I don't know if that helps. I just had less than a minute to answer that.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and thanks for reminding us that the global south is not just Africa.